blah, blah, blah. The extraordinary thing about Shakespeare is that two different people can go to the same play and come away with a completely different impression. The locus classicus for me is Henry V. Henry V has been made into a number of rousing films about Britishness and how we kicked those froggies' butts and we came away and we're winners, and Henry V is the greatest king that Britain has ever had. But another person can go to the play and see it as a searing criticism of monarchy and the power of kings and the perversion of rhetoric to do incredibly violent and destructive things and call it victory. A number of the plays have this strange duality that Shakespeare can present a spread or a range, and people will really look into the mirror and see themselves. When I first came to this country, I was rather horrified that I would know someone, a middle-class white person, and I would know them for months or even years, and then suddenly they would talk to me about immigrants or coming over here and taking our jobs. And then there would be an uncomfortable silence when they realized that I was this person coming over here to take their jobs. Or they'd be talking away and then they'd suddenly say, oh, gay pride, all those men walking through London with their asses hanging out. And you'd think, oh, I had no idea this person was homophobic until this moment. So it is very curious. Inside the locked mind of the self, how do you see yourself? Well, in a way, drama is very interesting because it's you, it's a performance, but it's also public. And I think Shakespeare, more than anyone else, makes the audience look at themselves, look at the self, and look at what's going on. He holds up a mirror that is brilliantly complex. You have seen that in The Merchant of Venice. People will go to The Merchant of Venice and say, wow, aren't Jews nasty people? Other people will go to that and say, wow, Christians, they're never going to get over themselves. I think it's really fascinating. What's difficult for you in an exam is, what did Shakespeare mean? What is the truth in the mirror that we're looking at? You can let yourselves off the hook and say you don't have to decide, but you can show what's possible and what is being held up from that to that. And that's what I'm going to try to do, because The Tempest is the most puzzling, come in, of all plays. Is it an airy-fairy thing about nothing, or is it a deep allegory about politics and the theatre? Well, of course, it's a deep allegory about politics and the theatre, but sometimes it seems to be about funny little creatures whizzing about pretending to be fairies and bees. How do you deal with this? Well, I think you need to go deep and look at complexity, because I think that's what you're offered. Shakespeare did see it as his crowning achievement, and I'd like to talk first of all about the strangeness of it. You are hit with a very odd interface, a scene that is impossible to stage on Shakespeare's stage, with a tempest, just as in Macbeth, storm, thunder and lightning and witches, and a ship that sinks. I don't know how they did it, but the curious thing is, this seems to me to be the unique play where he offers you a journey through the first scene between where you are in the theatre and the world of the theatre. The island, as everybody says, is an allegorical representation of the world of drama, imagination and the stage. It is the globe. You are offered the globe. The island is the globe. And I'm going to look at, in this lecture, the way nature and art are represented in the play. But first of all, let's go back to this first strange scene. The odd thing about the characters in The Tempest might be that the only real rounded fairy tale juicy fictional literary figures are all on the island already. When you come away from the play, which characters do you know? Prospero, Miranda, Ariel, Caliban. this is a very personal interpretation, but I think a fascinating one. All of the characters who land on the island seem to be more thin to me, more two-dimensional. In a way, they're like the audience crashing into the world of the theatre. All of the people who come to the island seem to be rather annoying, thin. Even the characters we like the most are Gonzalo. I often think of the play as, it's as if we in the storm scene crash into the world of the theatre and people from the outside break into the imaginary world that Shakespeare offers. And this is picked up in the second scene when we're asked to do a weird mirror image reversal. Miranda looks at the ship and says, "Oh, I saw the ship sink." It's as if these people then get fished up onto the stage. I think Stoppard absolutely understood this in The Real Inspector Hound, where you see the stage both ways. I often feel that the characters who come from the real world come into the world of the imagination, and then at the end of the play they're spewed back out. They have to go back to the real world. The Alonsos, the Sebastians, the Antonios, the Trinculos and the Stefanos represent all of us. And in a way, we're the cartoon characters, because the more real, juicy, fully rounded people are, of course, literary figures. Are literary figures more real than us? Is Lady Macbeth more real than Christian? In a way, very strangely, yes, because millions of people know Lady Macbeth as a real character. So these are the questions that it seems that Shakespeare is throwing up. The play is a complex allegory about the nature of power, but it's also a complex allegory about the nature of dramatic art, and it hinges on the character of Prospero. Can we go back to that first scene then? It starts with a ship. You know, and everyone in that audience knew, that the ship is a traditional symbolic figure of the individual soul, the state, and the church, ecclesia. The ship sails across the sea of vicissitude towards the eternity, which is the afterlife. You can see it as the individual travelling across the sea of vicissitude, reaching heaven across the sea. You can see it as the church, as it traditionally was, and this is guided by the Pope, the bishops, and the church themselves. Or more often in Shakespeare's time, the ship was the ship of the Commonwealth, the ship of the state. In this ship there is hierarchical order, the king at the top going down through all the members of the body Commonwealth. And if everybody does their job and does their function properly, the ship sails across the sea of fortune, adversity, vicissitude, and reaches its destination. I've already mentioned Macbeth, but of course I could mention probably every other play. People who like this game can find references to all of the Shakespeare plays in The Tempest. And the second one I'd like to mention is Richard III. In Richard III, just before his political assassination, Clarence has a dream in which he falls off the leads, he falls off the ship into the water, and he's down in the water and sees strange fishes. You can see this is referenced twice in The Tempest. Clarence is a typical picture of the adversity of courts and the great danger. Machiavelli is everywhere in the 100 years leading up to Shakespeare. He remembers explicitly what happened to all of those bishops, lords who had their heads chopped off in the time of Henry VIII and afterwards in the religious afflictions of the reigns of Edward and Mary. The court is always seen as a dangerous place. In this play, interestingly, the ship is run really well. Let's have a look at it. In the middle of impending disaster, "Boatswain, here, master, what cheer? Good, speak to the mariners, fall to it yearly, or we run ourselves aground, bestir, bestir." Everything in this communication is positive. Everything is said in a spare way. There is no extra rhetoric. Everything is said to direct one another and to achieve what is necessary to run the ship through the tempest and keep it afloat. The mariners, the boatswain, and the captain, the master, all do their job perfectly. It's an image of a well-run ship in adversity. And then what happens? The posh people. In a strange inversion, The people at the top of the social pyramid, the king and his brothers and so on, are down below. But what do? They have to assert their control. They have to usurp the proper position of authority of the master, the boatswain, and the shipmen. Good boatswain, have care. Where's the master? Play the men. I pray now, keep below. Usurpation is the key in this play. It's all about brothers killing brothers, people intriguing to take over from other people. Machiavelli was everywhere in this century, and the taint of Cain and Abel is everywhere in the play. Brothers plotting against and killing brothers. And that's what Shakespeare leads with. We have an image of the people at the top of the pyramid trying to take over the functions of those people who know best. Shakespeare presents a monarchy, an aristocracy, versus a meritocracy. Shakespeare, as in so many of the plays, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, questions the value of monarchy. Everywhere in Shakespeare, you see the central problem. In The Winter's Tale, Leontes suddenly decides that his wife has had sex with his best friend, so he orders her to death. He kills his own child. He causes all sorts of perturbation. The essential problem for Shakespeare is monarchies might work when you've got a good monarch, but they quickly, as Plato said, slip into tyranny. And that is the central problem. We are presented in this play with various versions of kings and princes who could behave well but do not. This play is an examination of under what terms can monarchy actually work. That's why you can look at this play and say, isn't it a lovely fairy tale in which kings come through in the end and do well? Or you can say it's a withering satire on the twisted personal desires of posh aristocrats and how, in fact, monarchy is very difficult to make work because it depends so crucially on the character of one man at the top. In a democracy, you have a group of people who have been elected, but where you've got one man who gets there by divine right of kings, that's the difficulty. So Shakespeare leads with, how do you make society work? Who has the power and authority? And curiously, who behaves well in this scene? Who is the master of communication? It's the master and the boatswain. The master's whistle that keeps the men going in this first scene is crucially communicative in a way that none of the posh people are. And of course, they lose their temper when the boatswain speaks to them very indelicately, and he says to them, well, use your authority. If you cannot, give thanks you have lived so long and make yourself ready to die. It's absolutely brilliant. It's the one circumstance where you could say this to a posh git and not get your head cut off. And he says it, and what does the audience feel? Yes, these ordinary people are right. They should be in control. What these posh people are doing is wrong. And how do Sebastian and Antonio react? Apoxy your throat, you bawling, blasphemous, incharitable dog. We are presented with all the problems of monarchy in the very first scene. These people must be in control at all times, and that, in a way, is the problem. We see them intriguing throughout the play to be in control, which leads us back to Magic and Prospero. What sort of control in a state is good and positive? What sort of magic might lead you astray? So, of course, this opening scene, we're led into the world of power, how it's exercised. Power, how it's exercised through language. In Merchant of Venice, you had it through law. Here, you've got it through language and how the state actually runs. We are presented with a series of little paradigms throughout the play and subplots with a king and his workers, a master and his daughter, a master and his servant, a master and his slave. Has there ever been such a paradigmatic play where we are constantly made to look at power relationships one after the other? And that's how he begins, in this crazy, wonderful scene in which they all split, let's all sink with the king, and it seems that down they will go and the state will founder. I don't know quite how to say this, but I feel in a way you've been drawn into the world of the play, and then you get to the island. As if we are in this interface scene, like a play within a play, we are taken through this extraordinary experience where we all experience death, and then we get to the world of art, in a way, a strange world where magic happens. So scene 2 begins with the island and Miranda seeing it as in a reverse mirror. We saw the ship sinking. She sees the ship sinking from within her illusory island, her world of art. She's called Miranda herself, a wonder, and she sees the ship go down. What's extraordinary about this? If by your art, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them. I have suffered with those that I saw suffer, a brave vessel, who had no doubt some noble creature in her, dashed all to pieces. You like her immediately, don't you? So gentle, but also so insistent and so suggestive. What's occluded? In her very gentle speech, there's quite a bit of rhetoric going on. Look at the apostrophes, look at the questions, look at the ellipses. What is she trying to suggest to her father? It's actually a plea, please don't kill them. Do you think it extraordinary? She loves her father, but she's also keenly aware that he has the power to kill the people on that ship. And she says, in the very gentlest way without saying it, oh, I'm suffering to think that the noble creatures on that ship might all have died. Why does she say this to him? She's hoping to influence him into not killing the people that went down on the ship or to save them. What does it suggest about their relationship? A, she's curiously powerless, and she hopes in this very gentle way to influence him. B, that she's keenly aware that he has the power to kill people. And then so it follows on. The rest of the play constantly throws up his magic and his power. Black magic, white magic. Power to do incredible evil or power to do incredible good. And of course, you're back, aren't you, with Elizabethan theories of statecraft and kingship. Should the king have such power to kill? Do daughters have any influence? What kind of relationship is this? What are fathers generally like in Shakespeare? Not very good. Look at Romeo and Juliet. Is this a good father? And here I'm going to get into trouble, aren't I? Because I think the play really requires you to concentrate. If I asked you, do you think he does well by his daughter in the course of the play and he's a good image of a father? Let's have a vote. How many people, and because we're recording it, we're going to do yay or nay. How many people feel he's a good father to Miranda? Do a yay.
Yay.
How many people feel he's a bad father to Miranda? Do a nay.
Nay.
That was very interesting. Is your rationale the same as mine? What do you see everywhere in Shakespeare? Love. People find love. Shakespeare's the great prophet of love, isn't he? We see a whole series of feisty daughters who don't do what Daddy says, and they go and find their own love. What happens in this play? He arranges a marriage. He arranges a marriage with his enemy, and he makes a political alliance. If you think Alonso's a bit cruel in casting away Claribel to that prince, he marries his daughter for an alliance. And you know what happened in Renaissance Europe? If you married off your daughter to someone way across Europe, in this case the other side of the Mediterranean, you're probably not going to see her again or see her only in years. If you may think Alonso's a rather heartless father, is Prospero. He makes it quite plain that he organized them to fall in love. And do you want to go 3 steps more? Does he use magic on his own daughter? Does she fall in love with Ferdinand, or did he actually make it happen? It goes on, my soul, he says. He had planned this. Is this an extraordinary example of an arranged marriage in Shakespeare's last play that we are meant to think is a fairy tale happy ending? Isn't it lovely that they got married? But it's cruelly ironic, don't you think? Do you think Prospero's a good dad, a good leader? Well, I have to come out of the box and say, yes, Prospero is a really good man and a good leader. But then again, no, he's Mr. Angry. Is this the longest scene in Shakespeare? It's pretty long, and what you're presented with? A whole in media res discussion of what's happened before, and then a series of vignettes. Prospero and daughter, Prospero and servant, Prospero and slave. If I asked you what's the chief characteristic of each of the three relationships, what would you say? Angry and hostile negotiation. We see him kind of fighting with all three of them. Not so much with Miranda, but how does it begin? She's pleading for him to save them. And then the more and more he tells her the story, the more and more he seems to be angry with her. Is he a good man? Are you kept guessing till the end? Are you made uneasy by all of this? Do you trust that the hero of a play will be a good person? It's a very teasing and riddling play, and once again I'd fall back on, please look really carefully at what people are saying, because you are being made to think about power in a very interesting way. Of course, we all know that Prospero represents Shakespeare, because as I'm going to get onto in a later lecture, Prospero represents dramatic art, doesn't he? And the ability of Shakespeare to create these worlds. How does Shakespeare actually make that work with the completely separate, or is it the interconnected allegory of Prospero as an ideal leader? Do we see him as an ideal leader? What's wrong with Prospero? Well, fortunately, he tells us himself. He was, just as with every other leader in this play, completely selfish. He turned his back on his own state and he gave himself over to magic. This was a common criticism in the Renaissance. It was a common criticism in the medieval period. In Richard II, we see a king attacked, eventually deposed, and the criticisms about him were he indulged his flatterers, he was interested in the arts, he turned to his own pleasure rather than putting the good of the people first. And that's what Prospero does. Prospero is a failed leader, and although we sympathize with the cruel things that were done to him, we have to ask, to what extent has Prospero learned is his redemption and reconciliation a complete thing? We get presented with a broken king of a small island in an imaginary world. Is Prospero learning something from his experience, or is he a fixed character from the beginning? Should he have that much power? I pose some of these questions to you. The first thing that he says is rather wonderful. No harm, I have done nothing but in care of thee, my dear one, thee, my daughter, who art ignorant of what thou art, naught knowing of whence I am, nor that I am more better than Prospero, master of a full poor cell, and thy no greater father. What's reassuring is more or less the absence of really complicated rhetoric and the extreme simplicity of the language. You feel that you can trust this person. But even in his first speech, what strikes you? Poor daughter, poor cell, greater father. Images of hierarchy, his nature and his true nature, are introduced straight away. We also know he has this disturbing power for magic. And so you are set up, even before he speaks, to question what he says. Is he capable of being a killer, sinking a ship and killing all the people on it? Do you trust this man? I'm going to leave Miranda aside for a moment and come back at the end and look at the passage with Ferdinand. I want to move on to the two other characters. First of all, Ariel. Ariel is an inherited inhabitant of the island. On what terms does Shakespeare present the relationship between Ariel and Prospero? He presents it as a contractual servant-master relationship, but it has a rather magical, mythical beginning because he releases him from a knotty pine. His mother was Sycorax, the foul witch. I don't want to talk about conjuration of the feminine in this play, but you're left with two choices, the foul witch in a hoop, Sycorax, and Miranda, but I hope to get back to that much later. Ariel was forced to endure her abhorred commands. What those were exactly, Shakespeare doesn't specify, but Ariel is obviously a delicate spirit and didn't want to do them. It seems that Ariel is meant to do Prospero's bidding for gratitude. He released him. Shakespeare gives Prospero some angry speeches and said, "Hast thou forgot? I did all this for you. I released you." Prospero's Mr. Angry. Do you think this is right? Do servants work for masters from gratitude for being released from slavery? Most commentators say Caliban represents the colonials of the New World. You might want to think about that and extend it to Ariel as well, because Ariel also furthers the allegoresis of the European colonizer who, through the bringing of Christianity, releases the poor colonial from the abhorrence of what went before. Sycorax might be configured as the Incas and the Aztecs and their filthy rituals of sacrificing people and throwing them down the steps with their blood dripping down the steps every morning to make the sun come up. Much was made of this in the early days of the colony, and if you go to Mexico City, you can see these obsidian bowls and the really sharp pieces of stone they used to slaughter people every day to make the sun come up. Is Ariel therefore a representation of the poor colonials who were released from the abhorrent pagan practices of before? I think in a way he is. What happens to him, however? He's made a servant. Should he feel grateful? How do you see colonizers? And here we have to go back. I'm going to take 2 steps back before I get to Caliban. You've read Conrad. You know how this works, but you are a modern audience. What does Shakespeare's audience think? Conrad tells us when you look into it, it isn't a really very pretty thing, is it? What justifications can you have for going all around the world, stealing people's country, stealing people's land, stealing all their resources, and then putting them to work on the plantations as slaves? You've got to have 2 things, haven't you? You need 2 arguments. A, you are giving these people something better than what they had before. And what was that usually? Christianity, Jesus, and eternal salvation. What's the other justification for taking away people's land, language, and culture? They are somehow bestial. They are somehow below Europeans. Because the thing that they did share with Europeans was original sin. And what European colonizers did was raise colonials out of the level of original sin, their pagan filthiness, to a level where they might be saved by Jesus. Of course, what's the problem with this argument? What will happen when lovely middle-class white people go to heaven? Where will these coloured people be? Well, presumably they'll be serving the drinks in heaven, won't they? That's rather brutal satire, but this is what you're presented with in this play. How do you configure Caliban and Ariel? How do you configure the posh, aristocratic European white people? Obviously, this isn't the New World. It's curiously not the Caribbean, it's the Mediterranean. But it is funny that this island also represents the New World. But you know all of this, and I will come back to this a bit later. You will know that Shakespeare read Florio's 1603 translation of Montaigne's essays, Montaigne. He was an essayist. In fact, Gonzalo's utopian speech is partly based on Florio's translation of Montaigne. And there are 2 interesting things that come up. Montaigne gives a list of things that civilization has that these New World savages did not have. Taxation, means of increase, letters, letter writing, judicial system. He represents many of the benefits of civilization that they don't have, but then he gives something that you don't expect. They also didn't have lechery, murder, cruelty, sedition, treachery, treason. He presents, as you all know, the noble savage. If you don't have civilization, you won't have all of the horrors that go with it, all of the ills of civilization, all of the sins, we might say, of Christians in Europe. He says, rather boldly, these noble savages in the New World might actually not be guilty of original sin. If they're not part of a civilization, they might be innocent. And you are asked to consider in this play to what extent Caliban and Ariel have an innocence. To what extent does civilization corrupt the noble savage and encumbers them with all the ills of civilization? It was quite a revolutionary way of seeing the New World, and I think it has been quite influential on Shakespeare and this play. Ariel's relationship with Prospero. Well, it's difficult. It runs a full gamut, doesn't it? Some critics have said it's a harsh view of a master-servant relationship in which the terms of the contract are fudged. There's a disagreement about how many more days Ariel has to do, and we can't work it out because Ariel says he should be free today. Prospero says, no, you've got a few more days to do, and yet he still releases him on this day because, as we know, famously, the play takes place on one day. It's only the second play, the first and the last of Shakespeare's plays, that follows the three unities, but I'll come back to that a bit later. What is the actual contractual obligation? Shakespeare isn't really clear. The other things that are difficult are that Ariel really loves doing things for Shakespeare, and there's the sensual delight in going through the veins of the earth when it's baked with frost, of flying through the air, of going through the ocean. There is a delight, a sensual delight in doing Prospero's bidding, and I'm going to come back to that element of the allegory when we talk about the drama, and of course Ariel, as you all know, represents the imagination. Sadly now degraded to a washing powder in Tesco. The other strange thing is they have an intensely personal relationship. Ariel is played by a boy, but the first thing he does is drag up as a girl. A number of commentators have talked about the language of the play, go back to it. A number of commentators have said there is a kind of pseudo-sexual relationship between them. Is this something you've discussed? If you look at the language of the play, he calls him by a number of names that suggest a great deal of closeness. I won't go any further than that, but there is much more than a servant-master relationship. And what do we know? Yes, Thomas Jefferson, that great enlightened man, did have sex with his female slaves, and, you know, there were children. This is often one of the things that are occluded. Of course, the slaves, the people of the New World, are slightly below white people, but what happened constantly? We see this again in another way, because, of course, what does Caliban want? He loves the learning from Miranda, but what eventually takes over? She's really pretty. When she gets to a certain age, he wants to have sex with her, and it turns into a rape scenario. Have a look at this that I've given you. This is at the extreme edge of the view of the play that it's a real smackdown about colonialism. Shakespeare is seriously looking at all of the problems of colonialism and the problems of European control of the configured other in other states. It's certainly not at the end of the spectrum of the play, which sees the play as a Christian allegory about the efficacy of mercy, forgiveness, grace, and reconciliation. But I'm going to come back to that because the play does have a warm, rosy heart, but it also has this. And that's what you've got to keep in mind in your exam. Please don't take a rosy picture that everything's lovely and everyone's happy by the end of the play. But on the other hand, it's not a dark, takedown of everything that Prospero represents either, but there is an incredible range and fluency in the play that allows you to see the mirror he's holding up to nature and the world in complex ways, because that's what's great about his drama. He's got those people in the audience looking at themselves. And as I've tried to argue, almost literally, because I think the people who crash into this world represent us in a very direct way, and we turn out to be rather silly and annoying. Are we Gonzalos, Antonios, Sebastians, or are we Trinculos? I think I'm Trinculo, a bit of a fool. But have a think. Pick your person. What are you like when you interact with people in literature? Who do you want to be? Well, we all want to be Miranda and Ferdinand, don't we? Fairy tale prince and princess. You don't want to be Ferdinand? I don't quite either, Fiona, but we're going to see that, I hope, by the end of the lesson, if I don't ramble too much. Could you please have a look at that? What are the terms of the actual relationship? Shakespeare has it in a very complex way. The relationship between Ariel, and without me teaching the text and going into all of the details, is configured in a complex way. It's hard to reconcile the initial argument with the extreme hints of affection and pleasure. Prospero often observes what Ariel does and is thrilled with the wonderful things that he achieves as the harpy, making the speech, making them go through the muck and being chased by the hounds. I'm going to come back to that as well, of course. The relationship, the delight that Shakespeare gives to Prospero in Ariel's actions seems to be at the opposite end of the spectrum of a relationship where they are almost in industrial dispute, with unions getting involved at the beginning, where they argue about the exact terms of their contract. And there is, in most productions, a genuine sadness. Was there at the one you saw at the Globe? A real sadness when he has to release Ariel. You know that often in aristocratic houses, I shouldn't say this, the closest relationship the children have is with Nanny. That's brilliantly brought out in Brideshead, Fiona, isn't it? That you do get this interesting, servants are really part of the family, and Shakespeare does go there with this one. Let's move on to Caliban. How do you see this one? This one is dark and difficult. Does Shakespeare have it both ways? Yes, because it's so complicated. Most people say Caliban represents the poor Indians of the New World. But in a way, isn't that a bit unfair? What are you led to look at in the allegory? If Ariel was the servant of Sycorax, Caliban is her actual child of the bestial, dark practices that many Christians saw were characteristic of people of the New World. They were pagans, they had dark satanic rituals, they needed to be saved. Caliban, therefore, should be absolutely happy that he's now been given the lovely European Christian patronage, though we never hear that it's Christianity that they give. What Miranda chiefly gives is language, and I'm going to come back to that, I hope, if I've got time. She gives him language, and what does he do? Well, as everyone said, Caliban is an anagram of cannibal. Is Caliban a dark, bestial creature? A creature who's so dark that he has a nature on which nurture can never stick. That's what Prospero says about him. Do you feel sorry for Caliban? Yes, because it's presented to you in an odd way. What do you hear first? Caliban comes out and says, "You treat me terribly." The audience all goes, "Oh no." Not sure about the relationship with the daughter, not sure about the relationship with Ariel, and now Prospero has a slave whom he tortures to get him to work for him. And then what do you hear a minute later? Caliban tried to rape Miranda's daughter. So you get a reaction away, and then what does Caliban say? "Ho-ho! Would it have been done? I would have peopled else the isle with Calibans." Do you feel sorry for Caliban? It's quickly slipping away, isn't it? And then later, Caliban makes the most beautiful speech in the play about the music. He wants to dream of this beautiful life. And I'm beginning at this point to think, wow, I think of all of the characters in the play, I'm most like Caliban now. I think I'm really Caliban. This is what's difficult. It's the humanity of it. Where are you with Caliban? Have a look at that sheet. What do you think? Is Prospero justified in keeping him enslaved, penned, and with no future other than to work as a menial slave? Prospero has a slave. What did you see in the Conrad? What did Conrad tell you about those poor black men in chains? This strange people arrived, they had a law, and what did they find? They broke the law, and so they lived and died in chains. What do you get with Caliban? When he does the primal sin of letting desire take over and showing his desire for Miranda, to which she said no, and he tried to rape her, what happened? What was the only alternative? Is it eternal punishment and slavery? Is that what Christianity preaches? Was there no way for rehabilitation, education, a way to make Caliban better? What are the limits of Prospero's magic, really? Are you a bit disappointed that this person who can make storms and things can't help Caliban to become a better person? Is it a condemnation, a bitter satire on the failure of European colonialization, that at the first hurdle, when he shows a human impulse that is anti-Christian, he is condemned eternally to slavery with his daily pinchers? We have to say that the pinchers are kind of jokey. It's not terrible torture. Does Caliban complain too much? It's a complex picture. But what is the audience asked to believe? Shakespeare's day? What's the audience going to say? Well, he committed a sin, a terrible sin. It's the sin of betrayal. You know, in Dante, in Christian terminology, betrayal of a lord gets you your head chewed off at the lowest depths by Satan. Caliban lines up with Judas and Brutus because he betrayed the kindness of a lord. That's what people in the audience would have thought then. However, you, in a post-colonial world, what do you think? Are you a bit skeptical that Shakespeare keeps railing at him? Caliban rails back, the spitting hatred they show for one another. Is Prospero a failure because he, as a lord, as the king of the island, fails to make the Commonwealth work except on terms of slavery? Do you want to do it now? He's got Ariel, who's a spirit, but the only human on the island is Caliban. Picture the Commonwealth. A king, his daughter, everyone else on the island is a slave. You know, you don't have to take big jumps to see Shakespeare is saying to intelligent people, this as a model for a state is a terrible one. What were you given at the beginning? A ship where the posh people try to usurp and almost sink the ship in putting themselves above everyone else. When you get to Prospero, with his commonwealth of daughter, servant, and slave, don't you feel it's a bit top-heavy? Isn't everyone at the lower part of the pyramid in rather dire straits? What do you think? Am I presenting a case that's a bit shocking? No, because Shakespeare very cleverly can, within a double mirror, show Prospero is a good person who, as Mr. Angry, can't really see that he has failed with Caliban. Does Prospero improve by the end of the play? What does he finally say about Caliban? Well, he says something rather mysterious. This thing of darkness I acknowledge as my own, and we need to come back to that. And what does Caliban say? I shall seek after grace. You can see this as the most beautiful thing in literature, or you can see this as the most appalling. Because what were the millions of people in the New World, Australia, Africa, Asia, the South Pacific offered by European civilization? Christianity, what will you do? If you work till you drop cutting sugarcane for 5 years, what will you get eventually, Olivia?
Salvation.
You'll get heaven. You won't get in this life, you'll have a bloody awful life, but you'll go to heaven. In a bitter twist, if I'm going to be bitter and twisted about the play, might I say that one of the meanings is grace what you really want, Caliban? Of course, the other beautiful meaning is he will seek for a better life, a grace that he doesn't have in his horrible loggerhead relationship. Of course, the main meaning of what he says is there'll be a better relationship with Prospero and with the rest of the world. Shakespeare is saying, is it possible to configure colonial relationships in a way that's not predicated on slavery, cruelty, punishment, and oppression? There are ways forward, but whose responsibility is it? Is it for the slaves to say, I'll try and be good and get on with the masters? How grown up is this play? I think it's incredibly modern. Whatever you want to think about colonization, post-imperial, have you read Edward Said? Yes, we all know these ideas, but Shakespeare got there so long ago. What percentage of the audience is going to see this? He always gives you something intelligent. Look at Merchant of Venice. Can you really see that Antonio is quite a bad man? That the Duke will just put aside the law for the sake of this? Can you see, in a way, Prospero, Antonio, Sebastian, Alonso, and Ferdinand? If I were American and Jewish, I'd say, these are my options? These people are going to run the world? Well, I'm not sure what to say, except he acknowledges this thing of darkness as his own. That takes us into the world of the allegory. You've got three people in this dramatic triangle, haven't you? You've got Shakespeare, the will, Ariel, the imagination, and you might say you have Caliban as the earthly passions, the center of desire or will in a way. We're getting into Freud, aren't we? The ego, the id, and the superego, but I'm going to leave all that till I talk about the drama. What's the thing that you're not told at the end of the play about Caliban and Prospero? What annoys everybody?
Is it that Caliban will he be free?
Where will he be? That's what I want to know. Are you told? You're not supposed to ask this question, are you? But you can't help but ask. Everybody wants to know. Will Caliban now be given the island to be king of it? Or is he going back with Prospero? He says he's got a new master. He's got his master back and he'll seek after grace. Who will he be? You've seen those paintings, haven't you? 16th and 17th century, little black children in a turban, all dressed up, pretty little objects. Will Caliban go back and become exactly what Stefano and Trinculo said he'd be, a monster, to be a seven-day wonder in Europe, to be shown to everyone and admired? Every time they went to the New World, they brought back an Indian, a South Pacific Islander. There are a whole series of slaves or people who are brought back as little trophies to be presented to people in Europe and dressed up in exotic clothes or dressed up in a wig and made to look ridiculous. Is that Caliban's future? Will he go back to Milan? Will he sit outside the Duomo and have a coffee? And he'll be famous because he's, look, oh God, there's that cannibal that the Duke of Milan brought back. What do you think happens? Of course, this question is completely unanswerable. What should Caliban be given? Should he be king of his own island? Let's see what happens. Who does it work out for? At the end of this agon, this dramatic process, Miranda finds love and happiness in the man of her life. She's going to be Queen of Naples and Queen of Milan, in a way, but of course, just with Portia, you know she won't. Who's eventually going to be Duke of Milan? Ferdinand. It's interesting. Ferdinand, the winner takes it all. It's an ABBA song. What happens to Ariel? He's freed. He gets just what he wants. He's going to fly about and live in a cowslip bell. He's fine. What happens to Caliban? At the end of the dismantling of this island, the bulk of the Commonwealth, the slave population, remains, sadly, indeterminate. Prospero says, I acknowledge this thing of darkness as my own, which I think is a wonderful thing to say. It's just like, in a way, poor old Marlowe, who can see, Kurtz is all of us, this is what we're doing in Africa. He acknowledges the thing of darkness, the heart of darkness, but is it better? Is it insoluble? That's what you're left with at the end of the drama. Does Shakespeare solve the problems of the New World? Of course not, but I think you get a real shock, don't you, that he cleverly, in this airy little play about nothing, can bring up the whole state of the world, the whole state of Europe and the New World, and the whole state of colonies and colonizers, rulers and common folk. I'm sorry, I've just gone way over time. We're not even going to get to those passages, and I haven't even started on the subplots. I think we definitely need Thursday, and I'll try and speed it up. The plot of The Tempest is ridiculous. It's based on two plots about further usurpation. We all feel sorry for Prospero, don't we? He would have been killed if it hadn't been for the kindness of Gonzalo in putting provisions in the boat. Everyone is a nasty pasty. Alonso, to gain Milan, made a deal with Prospero's brother, Antonio, and Sebastian went along with it. They are all prepared to commit that primal sin of fratricide to get what they want. The rest of the action of the play repeats the actions of the outside world in the strange, dramatic world of the Globe Theatre. On the island of dreams, this is what happens. In the real world, Prospero and Miranda can almost die. In this world of controlled magic, Prospero's always in control, isn't he? These conspiracies are never going to end up in death. But the conspiracies themselves are very interesting, and how the dramatic magic deals with them is also very interesting. Why does Antonio suggest to Sebastian that they need to kill Alonso? Is there a Machiavellian reason? Yes, because at the moment Antonio has to pay tribute to Milan. He's actually subject to the King of Naples. So he offers to his best buddy Sebastian, if you kill your brother, I'll help you, but you let me off the tribute. So he will be King of Naples, so he'll be King of Milan, Duke of Milan, and he will no longer have to pay tribute to Naples. He will have got Prospero's kingdom, and he will have got Alonso off his back. It has a practical reason. But do you like Freudian criticism? Have you ever done something evil and you think, if I could just make my brother or sister go in and not on my friend, it will be less evil for me? Or has someone ever tried to make you go shoplifting? Because if they're doing it, it's less evil, and if you spread it, it's not so bad. There's something deeply nasty about the way Antonio gets stupid Sebastian to kill a brother, because he doesn't know that Prospero's not dead, in just the way that he's done. The stupid evil spreads. But before we get to that weird scene in which he rhetorically tries to get his best friend to kill his brother in the way that he's done, there is the really stupid scene that I want to talk about now, when they first land on the island. Alonso has lost his son. He's in grief. And it's a long scene that's incredibly annoying. Was it funny at the Globe? It's hard to make funny, but it's a really strange scene. You have Gonzalo and that other twit going on and on and on. Alonso says, I prithee, peace. He's really nice, and he says, I've lost my son, I just want to sit here. But Gonzalo feels he's got to cheer up the king because I'm a courtier and that's what I do. He pulls everything out of the box. The Widow Dido, Thomas More's Utopia, all sorts of things. Ironically, however, the things that he does pull out of the box all involve people getting killed by bad monarchs. Dido messes with Aeneas, ends up getting burned, literally. Thomas More writes Utopia, on which Gonzalo bases his speech. Thomas More gets his head chopped off. In fact, even the little details of the weird discussion talk about or satirize the power of monarchs to be extremely unjust and brutal. So you have Gonzalo. What's he doing? He's taking the sycophancy route. Because what happens in courts where people are obsessed by power? People crawl all over. That's what courtiers do. We have Gonzalo in an agonizingly stupid way trying to cheer up Alonso, because that's what half the court will do. What's the other half of the court doing? The other half of the court are standing back and they're being, well, how do I say it? They're being bitchy, aren't they? In a series of killingly unfunny, nasty, sarcastic remarks, they satirize Francisco and Gonzalo. They just openly ridicule them. And I think you're presented with two mirror images of how courts work at the same time, overlapping. The sycophants and the nasty people who are there to stab you in the back. Shakespeare rather brutally presents how courts work. And there they all are, sitting on an island, on a desert island. He satirizes the life of courts in a very political play, in a very clever way. Fiona, did you find it funny? Who also went to the Globe? Was it funny?
It was witty delivered,
No, it's not funny.
but not.
Did it come across as extremely nasty, the sort of jokes they make about Gonzalo? Do you feel sorry for Gonzalo? Do you find everybody in the scene intensely irritating? I find it hard to teach that scene because it is meant to be a satire on the way courts work, and it presents both sides in a way that shows power attracts what? Rhetoric. Power attracts persuasive rhetoric. Gonzalo coming up with all of these things that are so pointless, and the other two men using, as you've said, witty rhetoric to put other people down. We see the treadmill of courts where people jostle for position. Shall I quickly segue to the other plot? What do you see in the other plot? Another Commonwealth. Another kind of court. Who's at the head of this one? A drunken butler. He's a standard figure. He's like the Miles Gloriosus. He's like the tricksy servant. He's a standard figure in Commedia dell'arte and in classical Greek and Roman comedy. The drunken butler who does not do his job and the ship or the great house in which he's meant to look after the wine cellar. He drinks his own wine, doesn't he? Who have you got also in this Commonwealth? Trinculo, a fool. You all know what a fool is, a court jester, someone who's not quite brained, as Trinculo says. And you've got poor old Caliban. In a way, this triad, Lucy, and the triad you've just had, the king, the sycophant, and the sneerers, represent mirror images of one another. Also, Stefano's little triad reproduces the triad of Prospero, Ariel, Caliban. Caliban figures in both allegorical triads. What is he in both? He's the bottom figure. Because when Trinculo and Stefano get going, what are they going to do? One's going to be commander, one's going to be lieutenant, and Caliban's going to do everything else. He's going to carry the bottles, he's going to be the slave in this one as well. Is this part funnier? Yes, in a good production, finally in a comedy, as in The Merchant of Venice, you do get to something funny. How funny is it? Well, I don't need to go over the satire of commercial exploitation. Both Trinculo and Stefano come on, they see a monster, and what do they think? Oh, I could sell this, I can take it back to Europe and exploit it. Even the lowest characters are in there for commercial exploitation. The satire of the colonizers and the conquistadors continues in the low comedy as well as the high comedy. The real motives of Pizarro Cortes are exposed in the funny banter of Trinculo and Stefano. These people just want to make money out of the New World. The overt joke is, of course, that they're all drunk. This Commonwealth is all drunk. But when you transpose it, are Stefano, Sebastian, and Alonso any better? What's happening in that triangle? What are they trying to do? Another murder. Is it reasonable or rational? No, they are just as drunk. What's the problem with power and monarchs? If the man at the top is bad, it's not going to work. It does seem to me in many ways to be an anti-monarchical play. He keeps presenting you with paradigms where the guy in charge might be good, Prospero might make it all work with his magic, but what do the other two triads tell you? What's mostly going to happen? You're going to get a drunk, you're going to get a a fratricidal maniac who's prepared to kill anyone, and that other guy, Sebastian, is so stupid. How long does it take him to work out what Antonio is telling him? You know, these people present the reality out there. We crashed into this world of fairy tale land, and what have we got? All the most bestial desires, our own desires, of the audience are held up to us. Unfortunately, how is a state going to work when the basic material is so poor? What have you got in literature? You've got princes and princesses. What have you really got in the real world? You've got Stefano and Trinculo. What's the good thing, however? I kind of like them. I kind of identify with Trinculo. He gets kind of peeved, doesn't he, when Stefano treats him badly. He's kind of drunk and silly and human and joking. In a way, they're both like all of us. They're just ordinary human beings who want to do well. What do they need? They don't need to be trying to take over the world. And I think that's the point. We don't need Antonio and Sebastian killing their brothers. We don't need Stefano and Trinculo doing this. What do we need? We need Trinculo doing what he's good at. What's he good at? Jesting. What's Stefano good at normally? Being a butler. What's the problem for us? What's Caliban good at? Who's going to clean the toilets at Heathrow? Nobody wants to do it. Yet what happens out there in the real world? How do you make states work when the vast majority of people, these are the things that come up in the play. And in these brilliant subplots, he makes you reflect back and forth, back and forth. Now I'd like to talk about magic as an allegory of power. Is power magic? I think this is Shakespeare's greatest joke in the play. Does David Cameron have magic? Does Queen Elizabeth have magic? No, it's outrageous, but he does explore this. What is the magic that you believe in? How many people did Henry VIII send to the block? How many of his own wives did he kill? You probably know, I can't keep it in my head. Was it only 2? It seems like about 17, but I think that I've probably exaggerated a little. Is it magic? Do governments run on magic? Yes, what's the magic, children? What was the linchpin of our coursework this year? Your excellent coursework, children. Rhetoric. Rhetoric is the magic in this play, isn't it? Ultimately, in a drama, it's the central ground on which human relationships are worked out. And so many times in Shakespeare's plays, language is that central area in which humanity must make things work. And it's the magic of language we are presented with. What's the whole first scene about? I said I'd come back to this. It's telling the story. Extraordinarily, there is no other play in Shakespeare where you get a huge backstory. Shakespeare never does it in any other play, but here he gives it to you. Prospero tells his story. The most powerful man in the play presents his story. The nearest one is Measure for Measure, where the Duke disguises and is powerful. There are interesting parallels there, and people are not sure about that Duke either. In this play, Prospero produces a rhetorical discourse. He gets very het up about it. Is it the truth? Yes, I think it is the truth. What happened to him. Is he truthful about him really letting the team down and being a bad leader? Yes, he is. Is he trustworthy? However, you are made to think about it very carefully. He keeps saying to Miranda, are you listening? Are you listening? Is it truthful? Are kings truthful? Is David Cameron truthful? What kind of magic do you give to people to make the state work? Under what conditions is magic acceptable? What do you notice about this play? The people are manipulated in a really horrible way. The magic is for their good. We have to believe that, don't we, children? They're shipwrecked, they're thrown in the water, they're dragged out, they're hounded, they're moved around, they're given strange dumb shows. Magic is used to produce a transformation on them. Every time on the BBC when I see an ad on TV that tells us not to drop litter or something, I think, is this justifiable? Are you allowed to propagandize your own population? What magic are you allowed to use to transform people? Why is this more difficult? Because you're dealing with the New World and Caliban as well as Europe. What magic in a state do you think is acceptable? And you know where I'm going to go now, don't you? The magic isn't equal. Have you noticed? What magic do you use for posh people? They're brought out of the sea. Their garments are stainless. We're told that. What magic is used on them? They see a lovely show, don't they? What do you give posh people? You give them a lovely show. You give them what's the most aristocratic of all art forms? The mask. They're given a dumb show in the mask. Forms come in, Platonic forms, of course, because we're dealing with Plato throughout this play. Plato's ideal republic is this play. So they're presented with shapes, mowing and mewing, or whatever the language is in the play, and they're presented with a banquet. Of course, this all comes from Neoplatonic imagery. Shakespeare hadn't read Plotinus and Pseudo-Dionysius, but as we know from earlier plays, such as Love's Labour's Lost, he's very interested in Neoplatonism, the sort of Neoplatonism you see in the painting that, I'm sorry, isn't hanging up now. He's very interested in these ideas, and one of the constant ideas in Neoplatonism is people who are not ready to accept complex doctrine or intellectual or spiritual ideas must be driven from the feast. And that's literally what they're done. They're tested in a very Christian redemptive kind of way, a very Neoplatonic way. They're put through a series of agons in the drama, and they are tested, driven from the feast. The harpy, the symbol of justice, of course, the harpy comes down, the Erinyes, and attacks the wrongdoers in classical Greek theatre, sent by Zeus to restore order. The harpy speaks to Alonso, and what happens? It works. They run mad into the sea, don't they? And they have to drag Alonso back. These aristocratic, Neoplatonic, mask-like, literary forms of magic work with Alonso. Then what do we next see? Their spells stopped. They're in a magic circle. They are charmed. The actual process, dramatically presented to us, is a rather gentle one. Does it work with Alonso? Yes. Does it work with Sebastian Antonio? No, you all know, so I won't deal with that. What methods are used for the low people? They're driven through mud. They're driven mad in a completely different way. Their torture is torture. It's not aristocratic. It's not educative. It's not Neoplatonic banquets with Platonic shapes. It's chased by spirit hounds through briars, furze bushes, and mud. They are scratched and made filthy. And of course, what happens? They get to killing Prospero, and we get a terrible joke, don't we? What do we all know about natives? They love a bit of glitter and sparkle. You can give them some beads and get the island of Manhattan. We've been down that road. So what does Shakespeare do? He puts some glistering apparel on the line, and do they fall for it? Of course they do, because poor people are like that. They're all kind of bestial, aren't they? Are you presented with a satire? A satire on the audience's perceptions of aristocratic people and poor people? You are. Does Shakespeare think you should treat poor people like that? Drive them through furzes and bushes and mud? No, but you're being asked to think in a big way in this play. Can you see what sort of magic is acceptable? What sort of magic, what sort of law? You've read Merchant of Venice. What sort of law is applied to aristocratic white people? What sort of law is applied to people like Stefano, Trinculo, and Caliban? Is the magic the same for everyone? You are presented with a satire on rhetoric, law, art, education, and the way people are treated very, very differently in European civilization. Is that fair? Is that something you've talked about already? I won't say any more than that because, unfortunately, on that topic, I'm running out of time. Was that useful? I've got 2 more topics to do. I only talked about I only talked about power, authority, colonialism, and I didn't really get as far as I wanted to go. I would like to talk about redemption, forgiveness, but I think probably that's really easy, and I don't need to talk about that. That's clear in the play. It's better to forgive your brother, even though it would infect my mouth to forgive you, as Prospero says to his lovely brother. But I do want to talk about the drama, Ariel, Shakespeare, and the allegory of the theatre. So 6:30 Thursday night. Thank you very much.